Hi, I'm Eric and you're watching Standard Meta Coverage here on the Sideboard. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep up with all the latest changes in the Standard Meta. Also, if you like any of the deck lists that we're covering today, you can find the full list in the description box down below. This week in Standard we had two great events to cover. Star City Games Classic in Cincinnati and the IQ or Invitational Qualifier in Roanoke. Star City Classic in Cincinnati was taken down by Temur Energy and Roanoke was taken down by Blue-Black Control. Here we have the Blue-Black Control list that we seen a very similar version of take down U.S. Nationals. The one card out of the 65 or the 60 that main board is different is there is a copy of Glimmer of Genius in this deck, whereas we did not see a copy of Glimmer in the U.S. Nationals list. That Glimmer of Genius took the spot of the third Essence Extraction. Other than that, and two Ipnu Rivulets being changed out of the land base, the deck is virtually exactly what we've seen in U.S. Nationals. Let's take a look at the sideboard where there are a few subtle differences. You'll notice that there's a couple Vizier of Many Faces, and we're going to see a lot of Vizier today because Carnage Tyrant being back in the format. A lot of people were worried about Carnage Tyrant. Vizier showed up, then Carnage Tyrant just didn't make any play, and Vizier started to go away. Well, now that Carnage Tyrant is back, you do see Vizier of Many Faces starting to show up again to give those control decks and other decks an answer to Carnage Tyrant. We see a singleton copy of Negate and a few Jace's Defeats to really help the control mirror. 4 copies of Duress, a few Gifted Aetherborn, the additional copies of Essence Extraction, and then 2 Gontis to round out his sideboard. This deck had a very good run this week. It took down Roanoke first place and won the Invitational Qualifier. So congratulations to Nathaniel Black on that. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Temur Energy list that won the Cincinnati event. So this is a lot like most of the Temur Energy lists that we have grown quite used to seeing. The couple subtleties that I would like to point out in this particular list is it's a lot like Seth Manfield's list from last week in the Nationals. You'll see that he split the normal 2 Essence Scatters into a single Essence Scatter and a single Supreme Will, a lot like Seth Manfield did. And the normal 4 of Bristling Hydra and 4 of Glorybringer has been knocked down to make room for a couple Confiscation Coups. There's also one mainboard Carnage Tyrant, which is reminiscent of Seth's deck. But for the most part, this is what we've grown to expect out of Temur Energy. Let's take a look at Temur's sideboard here. A lot more like Seth Manfield's deck. There are no mainboard Abrades in this deck and only 1 in the sideboard. A couple Slice and Twains and Nissa Steward of Elements, rounded out by an additional copy of Carnage Tyrant and some Vizier of Many Faces to help in the Carnage Tyrant mirrors. So that brings us with our Temur Energy list that we've grown quite used to. Since we're talking about Temur Energy, let's go ahead and cover the 4-color energy deck that we've seen this week. The 4-color energy deck, one of the main things I would like to point out about this deck is there are 26 mainboard creatures. He gave up quite a bit in the removal section and gave up one of his Whirler of Virtuosos to add in a couple of choice creatures to this deck. A mainboard Ronus the Indomitable, 2 Deathgorge Scavengers, and 3 Ripjaw Raptors find their way into this deck, along with the reason for the black splash being the Scarab God. Also, something that you'll notice is there's only 3 copies of Longtusk Cub in this deck. This is definitely Temur on more of the mid-range to late game side of things. They're not as built to curve out as some of the other decks. However, a turn 2 Servant of the Conduit and Conduit into a turn 3 Ripjaw Raptor or Bristling Hydra is one heck of a curve. So they still have the options to curve out, just as powerful as most Temur Energy decks, but they have a couple extra cards that are available to them that really help them push both the mirror and a couple other matchups. Let's take a look at their sideboard. First thing you may notice is a couple Carnage Tyrants and a couple Vizier of Many Faces. This is becoming very, very common. Also, no good Temur energy deck is anywhere without a few copies of Confiscation Coup, at least somewhere in the 75. We also see what has become quite standard in three forms of counter, whether that be Spell Pierce, Jace's Defeat, or Negate. A couple Chandra's Defeats, a Magma Spray, and a few Sweltering Suns to clear up the board for tokens. A singleton copy in the sideboard of Deathgorge Scavenger to round out the three for the entire deck. And that gives us the 4-color energy deck that we've seen in Roanoke. Now, let's go ahead and move from 4-color energy here on into a different form of energy that we've started seeing more and more of here lately. The Jessups first gave us this list in Dallas, whereas it has now been quite prevalent on the scene. We've seen it in every event since then, and it looks like this is definitely one of the top tier decks that we will have to be contending with. This is Sultai Energy. AJ Leakan took this to a top 8 finish in Roanoke, and there was also a copy of it in the top 8 of Cincinnati. So Sultai Energy, definitely a deck to contend with. The basics of this deck are just the normal counter package with a good control, a good kill package here in Fatal Push and Vraska's Contempt. Also, the deck makes really well at playing cards like Hostage Taker and Scarab God, whereas it has 4 copies of Blossoming Defense to really guarantee that they get to untap with these cards. Everything else is basically what we've grown used to with the counters. Now, what's new about this deck is he did cut down on 1 Hostage Taker, and he cut down on a Walking Ballista to make room for Vraska's Contempt. Now, some of these decks, we've seen some Kitesail Freebooters show up in the decks, but I really like the Glint Sleeve Siphoner here. So let's take a look at the sideboard. We do have a copy of Vraska and an additional copy of the Scarab God. A lot of these decks run 4 Deathgorge Scavengers. I know the Jessups did in Dallas, but lately we've seen that cut down to 3, with making a little bit of more room in the sideboard for other cards. Like, for example, Lost Legacy is starting to show up in more of the black decks, and that is relevant because now we're starting to see Approach completely be pushed out of the format, as there was no Approach deck in either of the top 2 or the top 8 of the events. I don't believe there was an Approach deck even in the top 16 of Cincinnati. That being said, there's a copy of Gonti here, which is starting to see more and more play in these sideboards of the black decks. A couple Walk the Plank, which is not the kill spell we want, but it is an effective kill spell nonetheless. A few Duress, and then 3 counters here for those notorious spells that we just can't allow to be cast. Let's go ahead and take a look at Ramunap Red and what's new in the Ramunap Red side of things. I do want to point out at this point that there was no control deck in the top 8 of Cincinnati, and there was no red deck in the top 8 of Roanoke. Both of the control decks showed up in Roanoke, and both of the red decks showed up in Cincinnati. I'm sure there was red decks at both events, and I'm sure there was control at both events, but not in the top 8. Now, I've pulled Jim Davis's list here from Cincinnati, and Jim has a couple cards that I really want to point out. But for the most part, this is red deck at its finest. It's exactly what we've grown to expect from Ramunap Red, with a couple little pieces of spice. We'll notice that there is a Hostile Desert here, which I think is an absolutely phenomenal card. Giving you a 3/2 for a land that you have already gotten rid of seems to be pretty decent. Other than that, the land base is pretty standard with the 4 Scorched Desert or Sun Scorched Deserts and 4 Ramunap Ruins. The real key differences that I would like to point out in this deck is 1 copy of Combat Celebrant to get some additional combat phases in, and then 2 main board Harsh Mentors. Now, this is a card that we talked about a lot last week in our Fringe series, where we were talking about cards that were set to really affect the meta. Harsh Mentor being one of those, and when we look over here to the sideboard, which we'll do now, we'll see the other one in Rampaging Ferocidon. Now, this card is definitely shown up, and the more prevalent that the tokens decks become, the more likely we are to see Rampaging Ferocidon And with the amount of text and how good this card is, I would expect to see some number of this card in red decks from this point forward. The card is extremely good, extremely valuable, and any aggressive list can make a lot of use out of all three of the pieces of text on this card. So be wary of Rampaging Ferocidon. If they're playing red, this will be in the sideboard. The rest of the deck is pretty much standard, exactly what we've grown used to out of red, with some PNLRs to allow it to go wide, a couple of braids to deal with, pesky artifacts, Chandra's Defeat for the mirror match or for Temur to deal with Glory Bringers, a few Glory Bringers of their own, a couple extra Chandras, and then some Aethersphere Harvesters for a little bit of life gain. But for the most part, red deck hasn't changed a lot, but with the arrival of Harsh Mentor and Rampaging Ferocidon, we see that red deck definitely has the tools to fight the meta, no matter what the meta seems to be shifting into. The Rampaging Ferocidon definitely gave it the tools it needed to fight against the token matchups. That being said, we're going to move into something a little bit different, something that we haven't seen so much of. With James Valenzuela's Mono Black Aggro, or Mono Black Vehicles. This is just a simple vehicles deck based around Heart of Quran and Bone Picker for flying creatures. Now, one of the best curves that I noticed about this deck is the fact that it can turn 1 1-drop, turn 2 kill your 1-drop or your 2-drop with a Fatal Push, then play a Bone Picker. That is an extremely good curve. A 1 mana 3/2 on turn 2 is extremely good, and comboing Fatal Push with Bone Picker in a mono black deck just seems like it's absolutely terrific. Also, Heart of Kiran on turn 2, very good card. Now, you'll notice that this deck has a lot of kill spells in it. It has 4 copies of Fatal Push, 4 copies of Walk the Plank, and then when we get to the sideboard, you'll see quite a few more. The rest of the deck is made up of good value 1, 2, and 3 drops. I will say another small combo in the deck, or soft combo, would be Heart of Kiran and Ruin Raider. Being able to use Ruin Raider to crew the Heart of Kiran, get in for 4 in the air, normally a good safe attack, and then to draw a card off of Ruin Raider, which the entire deck tops out at 4, so a lot of times you're going to be able to get a lot of value off the Ruin Raider, and you'll notice that there are quite a few 1-drops in the deck. So he doesn't plan to take a lot of damage off his Ruin Raider, but he definitely plans with the Heart of Kirans and such to attack as often as possible. You'll notice that Yahenni is actually really good with that action, because allowing them to sacrifice something like a Dread Wanderer and give Yahenni indestructible is just absolutely great, allowing them to attack in and trigger that Ruin Raider. Also, when a creature, your opponent dies, Yahenni just grows, and there are a lot of times where Yahenni can just continue crashing in over and over and over again for just massive amounts of damage. And once he starts growing a little bit, you'll definitely see Yahenni get out of control. So let's take a look at the sideboard here. 3 Harsh Scrutinies for the aggro matchups. Now, you'll notice that he has the Duress main board, but this is just a really easy swap out to trade Duress out for Harsh Scrutiny. 3 Gifted Aetherborns for the those hard-to-kill creatures and for a little additional life gain. But this is really good against Bristling Hydra and things of that nature, Carnage Tyrant. Bantu's Last Reckoning for all of the things before. 2 copies of Sentinel Totem, which has been the first absolute graveyard hate that we have seen so far. Most of the decks so far have just been running Deathgorge Scavenger. In this particular case, he's got Sentinel Totem because I'm assuming he wants to stop the graveyards altogether. Key to the city to get through those decks that produce creatures that are larger than yourself, and to draw some additional cards, and a couple Aethersphere Harvesters for the rest of the vehicle package, and some life gain. But that is Mono Black Aggro. This took top 8 in Roanoke. Really cool deck. I thought it was very interesting that we're starting to see some more aggro decks show up in the format. Speaking of which, let's take a look at Oketra's Monument, actually featuring Oketra herself. Now, like most Oketra's Monument decks, This wants to get value from playing, cheap creatures and making them even cheaper. Unlike most Oketra's Monument decks, though, this deck has creatures that are valuable on their own. They're very well priced, and that curve starts with Legion's Landing, which is not a creature at all, but it is a 1/1 for 1 that if you can swing with 3 creatures, you get a Danto the first fort, which can make more tokens. Along with Oketra and the Monument, you have quite a good token generator here. And what's a good token generator without a good Anthem effect? Well, Angel of Invention is a terrific Anthem effect. Most of the time, this is a go-wide deck, so this is not an Angel of Invention deck where they're making this into a 6/6 or such and swinging at you. This is a deck where they create a lot of creatures, and this becomes an Anthem. Even without Oketra's Monument, cards like Glorybound Initiate and the Mechanic here, Avery Mechanic, are just good value cards at 2 mana. 3 mana for a Fairgrounds Warden or a Kinjali Sunwing, just really, really good value cards. Kinjali Sunwing absolutely shutting down red deck altogether. Great card. 2 copies of Dusk in the main board, which are just absolutely phenomenal of closing out games against any decks that are larger than Oketra's Monument. And then a couple cast outs for catching absolutely anything, with a few Cloud Blazers for some additional draw. Taking a look at the sideboard, a Sky Whaler Shot, which is an interesting one, but we have seen a few copies of that in the past float around. Sunscourge Champion, which great for gaining life, and because of the cheap interaction, the cheap price of the card, and even the cheap Eternalize cost, you can gain a lot of life off of this. A couple more cast outs to deal with those hard to deal with permanents. Another Dusk to make sure that creatures that are bigger than them aren't going to hurt them that often, or even to cast the Dawn on the back side of it to bring back all of their creatures to cast everything again. Another Angel of Invention for when they need to get up in the air, or additional go wide, or even the Anthem effect. Then the rest of the deck is rounded out with a Sky Sovereign Console Flagship, and then some counter here in Jace's Defeat, 4 copies of Negate, and a Supreme Wheel. And that gives us our latest version of Blue-White Monument, which I kind of like better than our pre-Ixalan version of it, because the cards don't feel so bad when you do not have a Monument in play. So let's take a look at another deck that we haven't seen in quite some time, but here lately is starting to show up a little bit more often. And I think a lot of that has to do with the printing of Lightning Strike. I think Lightning Strike really gave this deck what it needed to get back into the meta, to become that tiered 1 deck that we remember it being. If you remember pre-Ixalan, pre-Amonkhet, this deck was the deck that just shut everyone down until a Braid got into the format. A Braid really put a hurting on this deck, but now not so many Braids are being played, so as you see Braids go down in the format, you'll see this deck start to arise back to the top, and this is Mardu Vehicles. Jacob Tilk took this to a top 8 finish in Cincinnati, and you'll see it's your basic Mardu Vehicles deck with Toolcraft Exemplar and Bomat Courier. 6 vehicles here in Heart of Kirin and Aethersphere Harvester. Scrap Heap Scrounger is no stranger to the vehicles game, along with Veteran Motorists and Depala to make those vehicles that you crew even larger. A Shock, 4 Lightning Strikes, and some Unlicensed Disintegration to either go to the face, deal with those creatures or other vehicles at instant speed, and then a couple Hazards to just really seal the deal. I mean, this deck can get in really quick, can apply so much pressure so fast, and a lot of its creatures actually have evasion in the fact that a summon sick creature can still attack you through a Heart of Kirin or something along those lines. It's almost as if they have haste on everything because of that. So let's take a look at the sideboard. We have 5 really good enchantments here. Cast Out, 2 Solemnities, and 2 Authority of the Consuls. Now, Authority of the Consuls, as we know, shuts down red decks. Limity helps a lot against the energy decks. Cast Out to deal with just any permanent you don't want to deal with. 3 copies of Abrade for those pesky artifacts that you just don't want to have laying around getting massive amounts of value. An additional copy of Shock to speed up, and then or to speed up or to be fast against those faster decks. And then here we see 4 copies of Rampaging Ferocidon, another card that we have seen in the other decks that is just being extremely prevalent in the current meta. And again, the more we see tokens, the more we see Whirler Virtuoso and things of that nature. Rampaging Ferocidon is going to be a occurrence in absolutely every deck that has red. 2 copies of Chandra's Defeat here round out his sideboard, and that is Mardu Vehicles. After Mardu Vehicles and all the Rampaging Ferocidon, let's talk a little bit about the tokens decks. There were 2 tokens decks this weekend. In Cincinnati, we had Esper tokens, and in Roanoke, we had Abzan tokens. Now, I'm going to talk about the Abzan tokens here because we've seen it a few times in the past, and this makes me definitely think that it's a 100% part of our meta now. I would like to see Esper make another top 8 or something before I consider it, guaranteed in the meta here. Of course, the same could be said about the blue-white monument or the mono-black aggro, but we have seen other variants that are very close to those. So let's cover the Abzan tokens list here. One of the things you may notice is Abzan tokens only has 1 forest in the deck. It has many ways to go find that with 4 Evolving Wilds and the 4 Renegade maps, so it's not really a big deal for the deck, and it doesn't have any self-mills, so no problems there. The deck is quite straightforward with Anointed Priests, Hidden Stockpile, and Anointed Procession. Everything else is kind of based around getting your Revolt triggers from that. Treasure Map definitely shown to be an absolutely great card, and I'm glad to see a deck making some use out of Treasure Map. Also, Treasure Map with Anointed Procession becomes a little bit insane. The deck runs 3 copies of Vraska is one of the major win conditions of the deck, other than just going wide with tokens. And again, we see our favorite white 1/1 vampire with lifelink in Legion's Landing. And again, swinging with 3 creatures flips that into a token producer in Adanto the Last Fort, or the First Fort, sorry. You'll also see 2 copies of Start in this deck, which Start to Finish is just a really good card. We've seen a lot of Start to Finish in these tokens variants. Some don't run as many, but some run up to 4. So Start to Finish, just another good way to create a few tokens at instant speed and a good kill spell to have around. Now, this deck has a lot of kill in it with the 4 Fatal Push, 3 Cast Out, 4 Fumigates for complete resets, and then Vraska, and then Finish. A lot of ways to kill. This deck is pretty much built around destroying its own creatures, sacrificing its own creatures, making more of those creatures and such. And a lot of scry power, even though there's not a lot of draw. So let's take a look at the sideboard here. Authority of the Consul is just an absolute phenomenal card. If you're playing white, it's showing up in more and more decks. Angel of Sanctuary. Angel of Sanctuary gives us a Fairgrounds Warden type effect that has the ability to be embalmed so that we can get it again. 4 Duress, a couple Argyle's Bloodfast. There was one card that was in the main deck that I didn't really talk about. Argyle's Bloodfast is just really good against those control matchups where your life total is not really that important, where it's going to kind of go down to you can either pressure them or they're just going to take control of the game and then it's over. So Argyle's Bloodfast just allows them to help get their engine online a little bit quicker and just gives them that card draw they need. A 5th board wipe here in Bantu's Last Reckoning, and then 3 copies of Lost Legacy to deal with those problem spells that you just can't have resolving. A lot of times this comes in against blue-white approach. Alright, so that is our Abzan tokens list. So let's take a look at one of the stranger versions of control that we've seen this week. Now, this is Grixis Control, or Grixis Amulet, by Anthony Can Do. Now, Anthony definitely brought us a spicy list here with this control deck. For the most part, this is a blue-red control deck splashed black for Torment of Hellfire and Cut to Ribbons. Now, the deck's major plan is to flip a Primal Amulet into a Primal Wellspring, and then copy a Ribbons or a Torment of Hellfire for a ridiculous amount. Also, remember this artifact is not legendary, and you can have multiples down. So if you have 3 of these down and you tap all 3 of them to cast the same spell, it will copy 3 times, and you will get four variants of that spell. Alright, so for the most part, this is just a cheap, low to the ground control deck. As far as cheap and low to the ground, I mean the spells are really cheap to cast so that he can flip the Primal Amulet as quickly as possible. One of the things I want to point out in the sideboard is he did run 4 of the cycle lands. I was quite interested to see exactly how many of the cycle lands he ran, because I know that some friends of mine that ran this deck, there was a problem with flooding out or not flooding out, and this was an issue, and I wanted to see that. So I'm glad that we actually got to see one of these lists do well, so that we have the backbone to one of these lists. So thank you, Anthony, for that. Let's take a look at his sideboard. Now, if you'll notice in the main board, the only plan was to be able to copy a Ribbons or copy a Torment of Hellfire in order to kill the opponent. In the sideboard, not a lot has changed, with the only 2 creatures in the entire 75 being 2 copies of Hostage Taker. That leaves Anthony with just more of control to deal with the meta. Now, his form of control in that is 3 Jace's Defeat, which is clearly against other control decks. 3 copies of Duress for other control decks, a couple more Lightning Strikes, Chandra's Defeat, and a Sweltering Suns to help keep control of the board and keep the board nice and clean, and a few Unlicensed Disintegration for a few extra points of damage. Now remember, an Unlicensed Disintegration or a Lightning Strike still is at the extra, that's 6 points of damage if it's been copied. That being said, technically you could copy an Unlicensed Disintegration 3 times by casting it off of a Primal Wellspring. So that would be 9 damage and kill 3 creatures. So there's a lot of power here if the deck gets online, and clearly it did come online for Anthony because he took it to a top 8 finish in Roanoke. Congratulations to you, Anthony. So let's cover the meta in general here. Overall, with the decks that we have seen, we had 2 control decks in Roanoke and 2 red decks in Cincinnati. Overall numbers here: 2 control decks in all 16 of the top 8 decks that we looked at. We looked at the top 8 from Roanoke and the top 8 from Cincinnati. In those 16 decks, we had 2 control, 5 aggro, 7 mid-range or energy decks, and then 2 token variants. So the meta is fairly healthy with the different decks showing up, the different versions of aggro, different versions of mid-range, different versions of energy. But for the most part, all of the mid-range is dominated by energy. Control is being dominated by blue-black control right now. Even the approach decks had no appearance in the top 8 of either of the events. So that being said, moving forward, I would expect more aggro decks in the meta, as aggro did very well. I mean, of course we're going to continue to expect the mid-range decks to dominate, but as of last week we had a lot of control decks and a lot of aggro came up to combat those control decks, and we seen aggro put up a little bit better numbers than control did this week. I would expect everything to shift to help fight back those aggro decks, and I would expect a lot of people to shift into some of the other mid-range decks that we've seen more and more of. Now, that being said, if the control decks do find a way to deal with the go wide strategies, I know tokens is definitely a bad matchup for most of the control decks. So if they do find a way to deal with the go wide strategies and the different variants in that nature, then they may be able to come back against the aggro decks. But for now, I would be wary of, if I was playing red, that Rampaging Ferocidon and Harsh Mentor are in the decks. I'd be wary of, we're seeing a lot more Sweltering Suns being played than before. So decks that normally do not play Sweltering Suns, such as Temur Energy, are playing Sweltering Suns. If you are playing a Scarab God deck or a Hostage Taker deck, I would definitely be wary about Confiscation Coup being put in the main board of decks. And then other than that, this is our weekly meta coverage. Thank you for watching. Check the description below for the deck list if you would like any of those. And have a good one. We'll see you next time.